This screencast is intended to help students with the study of the short story King Schariah and his brother in the Edexcel Anthology section B for IGCSE and Edexcel certificate students studying English language. It's not intended to be an absolute catch-all of every detail of the story. It's merely, or it's generally intended rather, to provide both ideas for discussion and consideration prior to teaching, but also, of course, to support students when they come to revise and look back over the stories at a later point. It's an interesting story because it introduces us to one of the great characters of literature, but of art in general. This is the princess Scheherazade, a princess who has intrigued artists, composers throughout history. And we are introduced to the girl here in a story in which, of course, her character is displayed for us in contrast to that of the king, Schariah. Before you move on, do some research about this character, see how she's inspired works of art across the whole world. And as your clue, take as your starting point the little brackets underneath the title of the story saying, "From the Arabian Nights." Start your research there. What are the Arabian Nights that this section of writing is taken from? Now, you need to realise that what we're reading is the introduction to one of the most famous literary selections of folk stories in existence. The stories hail from Persia and from further east than that, going across the Stans towards Pakistan, towards India. They are folk tales, and this an introduction. Think about this. If these are folk stories, do the characters need to have ever existed? What sort of characters are presented by writers in folk stories? Are they after accuracy, or is there something else that we are being presented with? Consider also how these stories would have been transmitted in ancient times. Can you find any evidence from the text to support the idea that you come up with? When you've had a chance to think about these ideas, then move into the rest of the screencast. And I suggest until then, you pause and give these questions that I've asked thought. As you move on, in paper 2 of English language, you need to be able to write about either a short story or a poem from Anthology B. And whether it's the short story or the poem, you need to address setting, era and location, structure. You need to show an ability to engage with the structure of the writing, whether it's a poem or a story. The characters, how they're developed, how they're presented. And finally, the language choices used by the author in presenting their story. Now, if you hit these 4 ideas closely, you will be well on the way to working towards analysis of any literature that you read in any context during your school and indeed your adult life. So, read the passage. Ask yourself, when is this story set? What times of day are used in the telling of the story? Is there a noticeable structure to the story? And how are the main characters presented? We'll look at them now in order. It's an ancient text. Ancient texts, whether we're looking at the Homeric poems or works such as this, a transmission of folk tale was generally conceived via oral transmission rather than by writing. This is the answer to the first question I asked a couple of slides ago. What features of the writing are there that might suggest that you're being spoken to here, rather than reading a cold passage? You might want to start off looking at line 3 as a place of beginning to discover. Look at the pronouns used. Are we being treated as a listener, and if so, where? After that, think about this. This whole story of Scheherazade is based against a background of the great king's palace, amongst the courtiers that work for the king, all of whom are men. What is the significance of that when we take the character of Scheherazade into consideration? The introductory passage that we are reading closes as dawn is breaking and Scheherazade starts to tell her story. Conventionally in literature, what is dawn usually used for symbolically? Is it a time of closure or a time of beginning, conventionally? Think about this question and then see if you can come up with a reason for the story starting at this time of day. What might it suggest about the ultimate outcome of this tale? Remember, this is the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. This is the first of the very many stories that Scheherazade tells. I wonder, even from what we have in front of us, can you predict where this story will ultimately have its conclusion and how this will happen? How might dawn be significant? When you thought about these questions, move the passage on and look now at structure. You might think there's no obvious structure here. There's lots of sort of shortish paragraphs, but it's not a poem, it's not in stanzas. But look at this. Take these two lines, line 36, line 79. What happens here to the nature of the storytelling? If we accept that there is a shift at 36 and 79, then the story splits into three sections, distinct and clear sections. So, your major question is look carefully at this. How might you describe the three sections individually within this story? Then look carefully at the central section, the section that starts after line 36. What's the major feature of the writing that stands out at this time? And how does that add to the vividness, to the sense of attachment that a reader has when reading this passage to the characters within it? How is that generated? All good stories make us want to read on. This story is no different to any others. Look how it ends. So Scheherazade began. You might think it's strange to end a selection with somebody starting. But surely this is the hook. What does she begin? In those three straightforward words, so many ideas are picked up. This is why this is so intriguing. Think of all she begins now. She begins to tell a story, certainly. She begins to prolong her own life. She begins to save all women from death. She begins to win honour and become this figure of feminine virtue, honesty and bravery. She begins to be of service to womankind. She begins to trick the king. There's a lovely slight irony in this, I think. The king has been deceived by his wife in the first place and believes all women to be untrustworthy. Scheherazade is honest, trustworthy, true and virtuous. But in order to change the king's perception, she is still going to have to trick him into listening to her telling her stories every night. It's a lovely little irony and worth picking up. Characters are defined by language in this story. They are clean, clear characters. There's very little description. We've no idea what anybody in this story looks like. We've no idea what the palace looks like. There's no wasted language. Pages of description of royal luxury or whatever it might be. Instead, it really helps to look at verbs closely. And I've picked here lines 40 to 55. Look at the verbs used by or of Scheherazade here. And at the end of this, think to yourselves, what do these verbs used tell us about this character? I'm not going to do it for you, you're going to do it yourselves. But look at these verbs. At the end, think also of this idea of her wishing that if she does fail, she says, her death will be a glorious one. And if she succeeds, she will have done a great service. How does this suggest her character? Given that, the next thing you want to consider is what the major contrasts in this passage are in relation to gender. There are two principal characters, the king and Scheherazade. What is the major contrast in terms of gender that comes across here? Let's look at the king first. Think lines 1 to 14, how you might describe Schariah in this section of the book, just the story, this first section. Look again at the verbs used, look again at his actions or intentions. Then consider, once he discovers his wife's secret, how does his character change? Take the time, pause my talking, take the time to actually prepare answers to these questions. Against him, how does Scheherazade weigh up, particularly given his statement on lines 19-20 about how trustworthy or not women are? Again, take the time to write what you think her strongest character traits are and how they are presented by the writer. I touched again earlier on the central section, the section that is full of dialogue. The two strongest things that you might wish to focus on, I think, in language here are the use of dialogue and the effect of dialogue, this effect of lots of first-person dialogues, direct speech, as though the characters are themselves talking in our presence, as opposed to being reported. But also this sense of the concise nature of the writing. There is no wasted word here. See if you can find examples of this total clarity, concise writing, this sense that there is no need and no attempt by the writer to perhaps muddle us or confuse us with overdone description. Which leaves us with what I think are the three main strands of any question on the short story or poem at this time. In this case, for this story, consider this. The presentation of contrast between the characters of the Sultan and Scheherazade. I suspect that most questions on this passage will focus in this area. How their characters are defined and or the contrasts between them. Consider the minor characters, I've not talked about them at length, and how they add interest to the story, despite the fact we know nothing really about them, they just have names or titles. And then consider how, in everything we've talked about, setting, location, time, era, structure, and so on, the writer has made deliberate choices in the way he has utilised language to create the effects he desires in the telling of this story. If you focus on these areas, you should find that you're pretty well prepared to answer any question on a passage such as this. I've deliberately avoided trying to give you answers. This screencast is for you to use in preparation, but also for you to use as part of your revision package later on, in the hope that the questions I'm asking will spark memories and spark suggestions in your minds. I hope you find it useful, and I hope you enjoy using it. Thank you.